Hey guys, welcome to this month's devlog. If you're new here, I'm working on a game called The Lasternest, which is a GTA-like game set in Perth, Western Australia. I have recently been trying to wrap up the important features of my game in time for the end of January 2025, when I need to finish the minimum viable product version of my game. A minimum viable product being a version of your product that has the least amount of features in it and can still theoretically be released or played. In the last devlog, I stated that I would not make any more quality car, road and building models, so the first thing I did was create a bunch of new roads which were just stretched out Unity cubes. I then placed a bunch of bigger Unity cubes around where major buildings were in real life Perth and scaled them accordingly. In this section of the map, in real life, there are lots of different buildings, but for now, since this is an MVP, I just placed some cube buildings on one city block and then just duplicated that block onto the rest of the city blocks that needed buildings. I then decided to make some cars. These new car models were, again, made out of default Unity cubes, but I made the cars have different physics depending on what car it is. I added a Mazda CX-5 with soft suspension and a Lamborghini Huracan with fast acceleration but stiffer suspension. I fixed a lot of bugs and issues that were plaguing the game. One of these was the problem where gunshots from the player's gun would sometimes not play, which I ended up fixing by increasing the value of the priority slider on the audio source on the gun. What I think was happening was there were so many sounds happening around the player from the cars and other things that the priority not being very high on the gun audio source made Unity not play the sound effect, making Unity focus on playing sound effects that it thinks were more important. Another big issue was with my loading screen. The way I set up my loading screen made it so that the game doesn't load everything in one frame. It disperses the loading over multiple frames so the game doesn't freeze while loading. A problem I had, however, was that the game completely froze when I entered the loading screen, staying like that for about 30 seconds and then loading the game. I knew I couldn't keep this in the game, not even in the MVP, so I tried to fix the loading screen. For some context, in Unity, a scene is basically like the stage where everything in a specific level, menu, or map takes place. There can be multiple scenes in a game, like a main menu scene, the main map scene, and in my case, lots of useless test scenes. So after making the loading screen load a test scene with nothing in it, it loaded without freezing. Now, I knew the issue wasn't in the loading screen scripting, but in the actual game scene itself. I should have seen this coming, as even opening the scene in the Unity editor took a while. So what I did was I chunk by chunk removed things from the game scene, to see if something in that clump of game objects I removed was the culprit to the frozen loading screen. To my surprise, it wasn't the player, the NPC spawners, or even the UI. It turned out to be a completely innocent looking game object, with the name Radio Stations. This is where I kept all my radio stations that I would beam to the vehicles in-game when they were playing the radio. When I first implemented the system, I did it very inefficiently, so what was causing the lag turned out to be the game trying to load only 2 files from the 2 radio stations that were there. 2 files doesn't seem like a lot, but the total amount of time that audio files lasted for equated to about 51 minutes of audio. After quickly eradicating the 2 radio stations that were loading almost a half hour of audio each, the loading screen worked fine. Because of the way my loading screen script works, the game had to load one huge file, so it wasn't able to disperse it over multiple frames, making the game freeze while it loaded the huge file. My friend debug.dev for his game was working on a console system, similar to Minecraft's, so he let me yoink it. I added a bunch of useful commands, so now, when you press slash, you can do things like teleport, disable NPC spawning, and enter God mode. I then realized that the player had no way to know how much health they had, so I added a health bar below the minimap and a red vignette that gets more visible the closer the player is to death. I also had a huge lag problem in my game. I checked the profiler and I realized that physics was taking up a huge amount of resources. I then realized a big chunk of that was most likely to do with the car doors. In my game, the car doors have a rigid body, which is a component in Unity which gives an object physics. Each door also has a hinge joint that attaches to the car itself, which, as the name suggests, makes the car door have door hinge physics. So, if there are usually about 4 car doors per car, and there are about 15 cars loaded at one time, the game might have a bit of trouble doing all those physics calculations. I couldn't just remove the physics from the doors altogether, as then the doors would be able to clip through walls when they are opened, so I tried multiple things to fix my lag issue. I couldn't just disable the rigid body and hinge joint components when they weren't needed, as Unity won't let you do that with physics components. I also couldn't make the rigid body kinematic when the door was locked, meaning it won't be affected by forces, collisions and joints, as that caused the car to float around like a Disney cartoon character when they smell a freshly baked pie on a windowsill. So what I ended up doing was removing the rigid body and hinge joint components from the car when the car doors were locked, and when they were unlocked, the rigid body and hinge joint components would be added back. While I was messing around with the cars, I also made the NPC cars finally stop for you, something I have been trying to do for way too long now. The next thing I did was model a very basic jewel store, for the mission I will implement in the next devlog. It's nothing fancy, but I think it will be enough for now. If you're enjoying this video so far, please consider liking the video and subscribing. I make devlogs every month just like this one, and it helps out a ton. The next thing I did was something that in hindsight I should have done ages ago. I made it possible to perform drive-bys. It was possible to shoot your gun out of your car before this, but it was more of a bug than a feature, as you are only able to shoot your gun from a specific angle in the car, and my weapon system wasn't made with drive-bys in mind. I tinkered with my weapon system, and now you are able to shoot any innocent pedestrian you want from the safety of your car. Around this time, I finally made the wanted system work. Police officers are now a bit more intelligent, as instead of throwing themselves out of their car when they get near you, they stop their car, get out, and not plonk on the floor. I also greatly improved the weapon system, adding the capability for customizable bullet spread and amount of pellets fired per shot. With this new feature, I could finally add a shotgun. It fires multiple pellets per shot with a large amount of bullet spread. Guns like the assault rifle now have small amounts of bullet spread too, as before, the bullet always landed directly on where the crosshair was. The final thing I did was get rid of all the warnings in my console. Warnings don't cause crashes or anything, but they are there to show you that there is something inefficient or outdated in your code. After I upgraded to Unity 6, I had like 50 warnings, all about the fact that the function findObjectsOfType got deprecated, meaning that there was a new better function and the old one is abandoned. FindObjectsOfType is a function that gets an array of all objects of a specific type in a certain scene. For example, if I had the code findObjectsOfType NPC, it will return an array of all the NPCs in the scene. This function is very useful, but there is one huge flaw. It is very unperformant, and I had almost 50 of them just chilling in my code. Something I did to minimize the usage of this function was to create a static class called referenceList and have it contain all the objects I would need to access from the other scripts. This would work, but then I found a much better way of doing things in my opinion. Tetron Studios and debug.dev introduced me to a method which involved creating a static variable on the script that I needed to access, and then set the variable to itself when the scene starts up. Static variables are variables that have only one instance, meaning that if a script wants to access it, they can do so without having a reference to the script that the variable is in. For example, the player script could have a variable called instance, and then at the start of the scene, the script sets the instance variable to itself. Now, if the NPC script wants to access the movement speed variable within the player, they can just access player.instance.movespeed, as there should be only one play script, so the instance variable would only reference one thing. Anyway, I did this method with a bunch of my scripts, and now I have vastly decreased the amount of times I need to use the forbidden function. But for the times when I needed to, I used the new version of the function instead, as the old one got deprecated. So that wraps up what I have done since the last devlog. I feel like at this rate, I can definitely make my January 31st deadline, maybe, if I'm lucky, even earlier, as basically all I have to do now is add a couple of missions and do some quality of life things, like a simple pause menu and a save system. Thanks for watching this devlog. I'll see you in the next one.